Now, let me introduce you to Manish Sharma. Mr. Sharma is a senior career civil servant of the Government of India, serving with the Indian Police Services. He holds an MBA degree, is currently studying at UCSD's School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, and has a diverse experience of 22 years of service in the government, including service with the United Nations and other foreign assignments. His background incorporates a unique composition of service in the fields of crime prevention and detection, maintenance of law and order, peacekeeping in a European civil war, ensuring transportation security in India, and as a diplomat promoting Indian trade, and as commander of paramilitary forces, and finally in the intelligence gathering field. Please welcome to the stage, Manish Sharma.
Good evening, friends. At the outset, I'd like to thank Chris and Henry for giving me the opportunity to come in front of you and talk about what President Obama has labeled one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. But before that, I would like to say that whatever I express here, any opinions, any ideas, anything that deals with my presentation here are my own personal views. The Government of India has nothing to do with these views, and therefore please take them with that in mind. This is a relationship that not many people have been very aware of, at least in the US daily life. And as the decade grows, as we move forward in the years, there is extremely increasing likelihood that most people are going to look at this relationship in a much more different way than what has been so till now. What I'm trying to do here is I'll trace the development of the relationship first by starting about a brief background on India. I'm sure most of you would be aware about that, but just to point out certain things, and then I'll go on to the main presentation. As you see, it's a fairly large country, the 7th largest in the world in terms of area, the 2nd largest in terms of population. If you look at the Indian economy, it's now, in the real terms, it's the 10th largest, and in purchasing power parity terms, it is already the 3rd largest in the world. It is the largest democracy, and just to give you an idea about the figures that you see there, that is the total number of electorate that is there in India. And that also represents more people than the combined populations of the US and Western Europe put together. Out of these, in the latest elections that India had, there were around 550 million voters who actually cast their votes. That's a very high percentage of about 60, 66, 67%. The country is divided into 30 states and 7 union territories. And as you can see, there are very many neighboring countries around as well. The presentation is basically going to list out the Indian foreign policy, how it has evolved, which are the factors that have shaped the foreign policy over the years. I will come on to the specifics in terms of what many people call a new beginning when Prime Minister Modi visited the US in September 2014. I'll then go on to the outcomes of that visit, list out certain areas of concern that have been there between the two nations, how we are moving forward on those areas, and then I'll come to President Obama's, what most people say, historic visit only last month on the occasion of Indian Republic Day. Give you a brief idea about what the joint statement holds and what the future holds for this partnership, and what are the outcomes that we have so far witnessed, although it's still early days in terms of seeing results from that visit. And we'll have a look at what the future holds. That's just a clipping of how the two leaders seem to have hit off from what was not really anticipated initially. I'll come to that in a moment. This is the latest visit that President Obama had, and they are discussing what eventually turned out to be a fruitful, let's hope it stays that way, nuclear deal that has come on now. The Chai Pe Charcha actually is a slogan coined by the Prime Minister himself. It means discussions over tea. To give you an idea of where India is heading, the present Prime Minister is the first one who has been born after India became independent. So till now, the leaders the country has seen were all born pre-independence. This is a shift in more ways than one. The mandate that he has got, that also reflects a majority after 30 years for any party, and therefore what it means is that the party at the governing center will be more stable, because in the last 30 years India has usually seen coalitions of various kinds, and any coalition party or several coalition parties in a coalition government, what that basically indicates is that decisions take longer to be implemented, to be taken, and so on and so forth. So that is a change that's going to take place. It already has started. The Prime Minister is more like a presidential form of government this time. He has a lot of control over both his party and the government, which was not certainly so in the previous years. And whatever policy that you see in the coming slides is actually a factor of a number of things in the Indian demography, the history of India, the size of India, and the huge diaspora that India has, which means the persons of Indian origin that are residing elsewhere, specifically so in the US, and how India views itself and its role in emerging multipolar world. I've listed out certain factors that have shaped the Indian foreign policy over the years. If you see, the initial years were primarily a result of the colonization that the country had undergone for a very long period of time. And in this period, the initial foreign policy decisions were all taken in keeping in mind that the country had been colonized, and therefore certain things need to be avoided while conducting foreign policy. The initial years also saw something known as the non-aligned movement, much decried in the US as anti-US, which it was not. It was basically a kind of a non-alignment from any group or center of power, whether it was in the West, whether it was communism. The foreign policy also has been shaped to a great extent by the 1971 war. And why I say that is because during that point, there was this specific tint that the US had at that time, and now those documents that actually list all that have been released. And they are now part of the National Archives, and they can be accessed easily. In fact, there are tapes, documents, everything, and these are visible and for the public now. Indian foreign policy also has been shaped by what was gunboat diplomacy at that time. The USS Enterprise actually entering the Bay of Bengal in 1971 when East Pakistan was about to become a new country. And what was happening there was that several million refugees actually were flowing over into India. And it was a time when the international community really did not have the same ideals and values with respect to, and commitment with respect to the human rights that we see in the recent years. And therefore, the human rights of these refugees were violated, there was no place they could go, and at the same time they were creating a lot of pressure within the border states of India. So India had to act, it did, and the USS Enterprise entered the Bay of Bengal at that time to influence perhaps certain events, perhaps to rescue the US officers in Bangladesh, whatever the intent, but that also has some kind of a psyche in the Indian foreign policy. The picture that you see, this one here, is of the surrender of Pakistan Army to the Indian Army, and this in 1971 December is also the largest surrender of an army after the Second World War. So 93,000 people actually surrendered then. These are the two leaders who were leading the respective countries at that time, President Nixon and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Finally, one other major factor that has shaped the Indian foreign policy is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And India has its own view. It's not a signatory to the NPT, and it has its own view that the policy is discriminatory, in the sense that it marks a cutoff date which lists before this date whoever has tested a weapon is a weapon state, after this date whoever tests a weapon is not a weapon state. There are certain other things also, so I'm not going into detail, but that has also shaped the Indian foreign policy. To give you an idea about Indians in the US, it's about 1% of the population. Indians are known as Asian Indians here, about 3 million in total, up from 1.7 million only about 15 years ago. And there's an interesting percentage with bachelor's degrees or more, so very highly educated subsect of the American citizenry. And the median household income of Asian Indians is almost 2 times the average income here. And these are figures from the Brookings Institution. To trace the relations, basically 3 broad phases, as you can see here. The first phase, right after independence, was kind of a cooperation where the US assisted India in many ways, starting with what was at that time known as the Atoms for Peace, which means provision of nuclear technology for electricity generation. Also, the Indian Green Revolution, which helped make India a food surplus state, was also effected through the assistance of the US. So that was a very good period initially. That ended in 1964 with the first in 1962 the China War, and then in 1964 it finally ended when China tested a nuclear weapon and India was actually in doldrums at that time. Then followed a policy of a kind of period of disengagement for almost 30-35 years, where both the countries had a prism of their own where they looked at issues from certain angles only. In respect of India, the 1971 tint, as I mentioned. In respect of the US, India was seen as a country that was pro-Soviet Union, which was anti-US, and so on and so forth. The third phase started in 1999 with the visit of President Clinton, and that has again seen the cooperation build up. And since then, in 2005, there was a very major agreement. I will come to that in the later slides with respect to the India-US nuclear deal that set the ball rolling for the relationship that we see now in a very significant way. 2009 saw the start of the India-US strategic dialogue. 2010 to 2014, again 4 or 5 years of stagnation. I don't know how many of you remember, there were certain incidents, very small incidents, not handled the way they should have been, diplomatic incidents that led themselves to be to come in the way of the relationships of both countries. Beginning last year, 2014 September, when Prime Minister Modi visited here, that perhaps was a new start. At that time it seemed so. Now it appears that the momentum is being built up in a fairly rapid manner. And how? Let's see that. If you look at the current level of engagement, this slide gives you an idea of the current level of engagement between the two countries, and this lists out the various sectors and fields where we are cooperating in terms of joint working groups, joint action groups. And you can see it's a whole gamut of activities: intellectual property, technology, defense, military cooperation, trade policy, climate change, and others. This gives you an idea of the people-to-people interaction that has grown over the years. So, as you see, very recently the US has now replaced the UK as the largest source of tourist arrivals into India, which is more than 1 million. So lots of US tourists coming into India. Similarly, lots of Indian tourists coming into the US, which is now close to 1 million as well. As we move forward, I would like to point out that in the last 6 odd months, the Indian foreign policy has seen a flurry of activity, in the sense that the Prime Minister has either visited a number of important great powers or has received the leaders of various countries, starting with his visit to Japan, Prime Minister Abe going out of the way to receive him in a city which is not the capital, in Kyoto. Then the Prime Minister of Australia's visit to India, where he offered something that Australia had been denying since a very long time: uranium from its mines. The visit of President Xi Jinping to India for over 2 days, and he started that visit in the hometown of Prime Minister Modi. The BRICS summit in between, Prime Minister Modi's visit to USA, and the recent events. This is last September's visit, when he had come over to here. And this visit actually saw a number of different things. And just to give you a brief idea, the relationship is now developing, or over the past years you see that there has been bipartisan support for the relationship, not only in the US but also in India. The next slide will go into a little bit of detail on that. We had very fruitful discussions between the two countries on several aspects. The summit meeting was good, and of course there was Madison Square Garden, because of which a lot of Americans actually came to know that the Indian Prime Minister is visiting. And what actually happened there, I'll come to that. This is what the successive different parties, presidents have said about the U.S. India relationship, both Democrats and Republicans, and that indicates a strong U.S. commitment. Similarly, the next slide will show you what the Indian Prime Ministers have said. And again, bipartisan, the Congress and the BJP both have been committed to a very fruitful US-India relationship in the recent years. The MSG event that I was talking about, so the US newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, every newspaper reported that this was the first time that a politician from outside the US, and someone who was not a rock star or a sports person, was actually able to fill up the Madison Square Garden. And there were 20,000 people there to listen to the Indian Prime Minister in September. Several congressmen, several senators, and there were some governors as well. The things that came out of the visit was some US commitments in terms of figures of investment, CEOs meetings on both sides. India has promised and actually now implemented visas on arrival for the US citizens, and the US investments actually now taking place even as we speak in India. The areas of concern and what we have seen in the past, issues that have actually assisted in or actually hindered the relationship from moving forward at a pace that both the countries would have liked it to be. There is this feeling, has been in the past, that the relationship has not been living up to its true potential. That seems to be changing as of now after the recent visit. there is a section of the bureaucracy in both countries that has still the same mindsets that have governed them since the days of the Cold War. So in the US as well, in India as well, and that actually plays a big part in implementing anything or in the successful implementation of what has been decided at the leadership level. But that is I believe personally that it is bound to change as the leaders interact more and more and as the scope of interaction grows. The US has felt that India did not do its part in the nuclear deal that the US assisted in getting it in 2005. Also some issues with respect to fighters that there was a huge Indian order worth 126 planes which did not go to US companies and instead it went to a European company. So that was again trade restrictions in terms of barriers. On climate, the countries have not really seen the same way till very recently. I see some kind of a convergence emerging after the recent visit. Still lots of work to be done. India on its own has its issues where it feels that the US restricts visas to highly skilled Indians. There are issues in WTO where the US on its own is protecting its agriculture but at the same time insisting that India lower certain barriers. Technology transfers that have been promised over the years not taking place. So both countries have had their issues, some of which still are areas of concern. What I believe is going forward, the private corporations, both in the US and in India, are key to the success of the relationship. That is what is going to drive the relationship in the future, and that is where the hope lies. The US, of course, and it has a shared democracy. The US and India are shared democratic values. The US sees it that way. The US also sees that there is a huge economic interest in terms of India. Not only India as a huge market, but also as a source of investment and talent. And there is this strategic issue as well where there is talk in certain sections of the influence of China and how the US sees the rise of India there. India, of course, sees US assistance in its own economic development, rapid economic development. In fact, recently the World Bank has come out and the IMF, both of them have come out with figures that say that in 2016, India is going to overtake China as the fastest growing large economy. So it seems to be finally happening. Issues of global governance, where India foresees that there are certain institutions, the United Nations Security Council, I'm sorry, that should read IMF actually, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, the International Energy Agency, all of these created in 1945 reflect the realities of 1945. India has been raising these issues that these institutions need reform. Of course, the US on more than one occasion has supported India's candidature of permanent representation in the UN Security Council, but that's just one aspect. So several aspects that interest India and the US. Lots of defense cooperation, just to give you an idea here of what is happening. Lots of joint exercises between the two countries, navies, army, air force, marines, every agency of the defense department. The Indo-US defense trade, there was a time when US was, I think not very long ago, till 2003, number 14 in terms of arms coming from the US. It's gradually moved up, and as of now, the US is the largest source of arms for India, and that's a huge aspect of the relationship. Some recent acquisitions, to give you an idea, 2006, billions of dollars of arms being purchased by India. This is likely to continue, as well as this Indian insistence on transfer of technology, so that this Make in India that the Prime Minister Modi has been one of the programs that he has been central to his idea. That perhaps will become part of that. Just to give you an idea of India's relationships with other powers as well. So the US, of course, the most important relationship as we move forward now. But in terms of the past, Russia has been, or the Soviet Union at that time. So when the incident that I was narrating about 1971, after that, India actually entered into a treaty of defense and cooperation and friendship with the USSR, which was actually a follow-up of what had happened previously. But then there were a lot of issues that the Russians helped India with, including military hardware at a time when it was not easily available. So that relationship has seen its ups and downs as well. Now the Russians are concentrating on energy. Export of energy to India is already the third largest, probably the fourth largest energy consumer in the world and growing. Australia has had an important relationship now. The other countries as well, G20, Africa, and why I gave you this idea is, even though all these relationships are important, the single factor that overrides all these relationships in favor of the US is this. So the India actually has about 25 to 30 million persons of Indian origin outside India, and out of this 11% are there in the US. So this is a huge diaspora that has very recently worked in favor of cooperation, close cooperation between the two countries. And going forward, it appears that it's going to be so, more so in fact, as we move ahead. They send a lot of remittances to India. Finally, the visit now. And President Obama, when he visited India, there were two significant firsts. One was that he was the first US president ever to be invited at what is perhaps one of the most significant events in India, which is the Republic Day Parade. So he was invited as a chief guest of the Republic Day Parade. This is something that was unthinkable even 5 years ago, because in India, for an Indian leader or for an Indian political party to be very closely associated or seen to be associated with the US is politically impossible. So this was something that had never happened. It's a bold change, and I'm sure that we are going to see a lot of positives coming out of that. President Obama accepting that invitation again sent a huge message across both countries. He's also the first US president to visit India twice in office. And I've read in a couple of publications that the dates of the State of the Union address were also decided once these dates were decided, so there was some movement there. The visit is also important because it's the second summit meeting in very close proximity, in September and then in January. So usually top two leaders of two countries do not meet so often. So there is something going on in the relationship. Let's see what is happening, and much also has to do with the US rebalance as it is now known to the Asia and Pacific. That's how they landed and started the India visit. So for most of you, you know that. For those of you who don't, that's a traditional Indian greeting. It's known as Namaste, and both the First Lady and President Obama alighting from the aircraft there. That is the ceremonial guard of honor that the US President was given at the Indian Republic Day, not at the Republic Day, I'm sorry, this is at the Rashtrapati Bhavan, which is where the President of India resides and his office is there. This is part of I thought I'll put in some slides of the colorful Indian Republic Day Parade so that, gives you an idea of what President Obama witnessed for a very long time sitting there. And they say that the US Secret Service usually doesn't allow him to sit outside for more than 45 minutes. And he sat there for 2 hours, so that was again a departure. And as you can see, they've been enjoying, they've been discussing. President Obama, that is the Indian President, Pranab Mukherjee, Prime Minister Modi. Look at this, and this also tells you the significant differences, significant positive differences that are coming in the relationship. In the 52 years, 54 years since independence, 3 US presidents visited India. In the last 15 years, 4 have already done so. And this is going to grow. That's another view of the Rajpath, which is the one of the main roads in Delhi where the Republic Day parade is held. The US India joint statements. So, now joint statements are usually matter of sometimes, people take them with a matter of routine that every country leaders will issue joint statements. But if you look at the joint statements emanating out of the US India relationship, specifically the last one, you will see very many positives coming in. I'll come to the first point later, but the statement emphasizes the important role of both countries for security, peace, prosperity, stability and security in the Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean regions. The statement also says that India's Act East policy and the US rebalance to Asia provide opportunities for India, the US and the other Asia Pacific countries to work closely to strengthen regional ties. Finally, both these two visits, the visit of Prime Minister Modi earlier to the US and the visit of President Obama to India, there has also been a huge deal of symbolism apart from the substance that we are seeing, and this symbolism has been in the forms of President Obama for this time speaking numerous sentences in Hindi in India, and that is something that the Indian audience loves. If you speak in the local language, they really lap it up. So that was something that was unusual. They've used phrases, joint phrases. Chale saath saath means forward, together we go. This was in September 2014. They have now moved into action. Sanja Prayas Sabka Vikas, and this is part of the joint statement, which means shared effort and progress for all. So, when I was saying the longest and the broadest, look at the joint statements that have been there so far. President Carter's visit, 1,100 words odd. President Clinton, 2,000, 1,300 words. And then you start looking at the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's visit to the US, 2005. Prime Minister Modi's visit last year. And look at it now. So it's been growing. Of course, there's a lot of depth in the relationship that's going forward. Various sectors where they have been cooperating. So that is a very positive indication and also a strong telling point. This is the banquet that was hosted in honor of President Obama in India. Coming to the nuclear deal, which has been a bone of contention in the past. Hopefully, it has been resolved now. Both the leaders actually have mentioned that we have had a breakthrough in the nuclear deal. Just to give an idea to those people who might not have an idea of what actually was the bone of contention. So, in 2005, the US and India agreed into what is known as the 123 agreement. And this was basically allowing Indian companies to trade in nuclear commerce through the international community. And since what had happened was since 1974, when India had tested its first peaceful nuclear explosion as it was known. Since then there was a technology ban on India from the West. And the non-proliferation lobby in the US had ensured in that remaining in place for 30 years. And that had actually affected the relations to a great deal. President Bush and Prime Minister Singh signed this deal where it allowed India to trade in it, and it also allowed the US companies to invest in what is a hugely growing nuclear market in India for nuclear power reactors. Now this was a deal which was at that point considered a very significant breakthrough. What actually happened later on was that India, because of its concerns of accidents, passed a law, the Nuclear Civil Liability Law. And this law stated that it spoke about the responsibility of the operator and the responsibility of the supplier of the equipment in terms of an accident taking place. And this actually law derived from what India had witnessed in 1984, which is till today the largest industrial disaster in the world, where the gas that had come out from American plants in Bhopal, in a city called Bhopal, it's also my hometown actually, that gas killed about 2,500 people. And those issues, the legal issues, are still continuing. So that's how this law came into place. Once the law came into place, the US companies felt that it was denying them an opportunity to invest, because it was a huge risk because of the law, and they said it's not economically viable to invest. That is where it was stuck. Now what has happened is that both the countries seem to have found a way out of the impasse in terms of creating an insurance pool. The details are still not available to us. Maybe in a few days they will be. But there is an insurance pool which will take care of these liabilities of US companies or French companies or other companies for that matter. What has happened is now, primarily there were two US companies, Westinghouse and GE, that were interested in and that are the main players, and that were interested in investing in India. They have welcomed the agreement. It appears that they seem to find a way out of the impasse. What's also important is that the companies pick up the tempo now, because if it doesn't happen, there are other countries, other companies that are already doing this. So there is a possibility that even though the US assisted India in getting into this, the other countries might take benefit of that, and the US companies might not be able to. That's why this impasse has now been broken, and both the countries, the companies are hopeful in both the countries that it should lead to more fruitful interaction and investments. This is just what I just recently spoke about. Barack Obama, President, saying that we achieved a breakthrough and are moving towards full implementation of the Civil Nuclear Energy Deal. Civil nuclear cooperation is a step to elevate our relationship. There have been some agreements in President Obama's recent visit to India on climate change, where the US has promised assistance in setting up clean energy projects in India with respect to solar energy and other renewables. And they have decided to work towards achieving a common solution in the upcoming Paris summit. Other issues, that were addressed: defense, terrorism, apart from the nuclear deal. So what are the geopolitical implications? As I see it, the interests on both sides are now more or less aligned, which were not so for very many years. Even though they might not be exactly the same as each other wants to see it, but they are very closely aligned. And several sectors, the nuclear deal, defense and trade, will move the relationship closer going forward. Some challenges might emerge. We'll talk about those in just a bit. Another one of those colorful tableaus, part of the Indian Rajpath Republic Day parade. The US National Security Strategy, which has just come out, and it's come out after 5 years. The last one was in 2010, the one in 2015. And it also lists out various things. So these two are from the US National Security Strategy. The first one is from the joint statement. Actually, not from the joint statement. This is now a separate US India joint strategic vision that has come out of the two leaders meeting, which speaks about the Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean region. In the National Security Strategy, it says, the US strategy says, we are primed to unlock the potential of our relationship with India. We see a strategic convergence with India's Act East policy and our continued implementation of rebalance. An interesting, again, a chart that basically tells you about US investment in India and Indian investment in US, something that most people may not have heard of. So if you look at, of course, the US investment is fairly high, likely to grow. But if you look at Indian investment in the US now, it's the same as the US investment in India in 2003. So India is also investing almost $4 billion in the US Now, there is huge potential for the relationship. It is only $100 billion as of now, as of 2013. 60 billion in trade, in goods, and 40 in services, as against the Chinese one, which is almost 5 times larger. So there's a huge scope in the trade relationship as well. So we need to keep in mind a couple of things. Both are democracies, and both democracies, any large democracy, have their own compulsions. So there will always be domestic issues. There will be debates, differences play out in the public. The media is fiercely independent and strong in both the countries. So the domestic politics always needs to be considered, and all these issues play a part in how fast a relationship can move forward. So that needs to be kept in mind. Of course, the reliability issues with respect to both countries need to be overcome. The areas where we see convergence emerging is maritime areas, cyber networking. Naval coordination is something where close interaction is going to take place, where the US Navy wants the Indian Navy to come out actively and participate in a number of things that they have in mind. Also, greater cooperation in climate change, counter-terrorism, and defense and trade. Like I said earlier, the private sector has to play an important part, and the U.S. India Business Council, which is in the US, that is the key to the relationship moving forward in many ways. Another and final picture, this is basically a paramilitary Indian force that performs on the Republic Day, and they are motorcycle outriders, and they've created all kinds of records while doing this. So, the road ahead, like I mentioned, several obstacles. There can be a drift, differences might dominate, domestic politics, X and Y, so many opportunities that we just talked about. So, huge opportunities, some obstacles that need to be overcome, but the relationship holds promise for the future. And in conclusion, I would like to point out what both of them wrote in a joint editorial in the Washington Post. As nations committed to democracy, liberty, diversity, and enterprise, India and the US are bound by common values and mutual interests. We have each shaped a positive trajectory of human history, and through our joint efforts, our natural and unique partnership can help shape international security and peace for years to come. And I think that says it all. Thank you. Questions, anything on any issue, whether it was covered, whether it wasn't covered, anything that you may feel like knowing about India? Yes, madam.
What is India's policy on terrorism and what's going on in the Middle East? How involved are they?
So India's policy on terrorism has been very standard over the years, and this policy has been that all kinds of terrorism is bad. There are no really good terrorists or bad terrorists. So you cannot say that this terrorist at this point in time is working in our favor and therefore needs to be left alone. And there are no moderate terrorists and there are no extreme terrorists. So that has been the policy always. India actually has also suffered from terrorism since a very long time, starting with early 1970s when we had several of our aircraft hijacked, taken to Pakistan, taken to other countries, some of them blown up, some of them returned after taking ransoms and other things. And this was much before terrorism actually came into the US. Just to give you an idea from my own experience, I was in the US in 2001 as part of what is known as the counter-terrorism cooperation between US and India, and President Clinton had initiated that program. And as part of this program, there were 10 officers from India and about 10 officers from the US from different agencies. We sat together for a month, discussed a lot of strategies, tactics on ways in which to deal with terrorism, counter-terrorism tactics. And one thing that used to come out at that time And remember, this is pre-9/11. This was 2001 March. One thing that used to come out at that time when we spoke to our counterparts from the US was when we told them that this is one of our major terrorism incidents had happened in 1999 when a plane full of passengers was taken to Afghanistan, the Taliban regime, Kandahar. And when we would mention these incidents, we were told by our counterparts that no, this is not terrorism, you need to address the human rights grievances and those kind of issues. And then 6 months down the line, the entire view of terrorism has changed in the US. So the Indian policy has always been constant on terrorism. The US and India are now deeply cooperating also. For example, the Indian incident of the hotels, the 2008 Mumbai incident, in that there was huge cooperation between the US and India, and one of the main accused actually was caught by the US, and the US allowed the Indian agencies also to work closely with them on that. So that is a cooperation that has been developing over the years. In terms of the final part of your question, in terms of the Middle East, so the Indian policy even there looks at terrorism from the same standpoint, that terrorism emanating out of from any country is bad, whether it is in the Middle East, whether it is in our neighborhood, whether it is elsewhere.
Will they actively participate in this global?
Not as yet, and that again is a decision that will need to be taken up by the leadership at the senior most level, because India believes that any international participation, armed participation, has to come through the UN. There cannot be a group of countries deciding. G1 or G7 or G8 cannot decide what is good for the country, for the world. So it has to come through the UN. If it is a UN authorized operation, India usually participates. Yes?
How does this U.S.-India new relationship shape up, keeping Pakistan being the friendly nation of U.S. for so long? Like, what is the angle from the Pakistani perspective of India-U.S. relationship?
Okay, so that's a question that needs to be addressed. It's a good question. Also from the perspective that what has happened over the past several decades is that the US has viewed the relationship with India in a hyphenized context, which means whenever there was talk of India, there was also talk of Pakistan simultaneously. Now, the Indian position has been that these are two very different countries, two very different economies. The Indian economy is almost 8 times Pakistan's, the Indian population is 8 times Pakistan's. So you really cannot compare both the countries every time that you speak of one country. Pakistan should have an independent relationship with the US on its own, and so should India. This hyphenization of the relationship should not be there. That seems to have had some kind of effect, and that dehyphenization is now taking place. In terms of the Pakistani view, I'm not sure how they feel about it, but perhaps they look at things from the perspective of more symbols, and they are a strategic partner in ways that India has not been till now. For example, Afghanistan was a place where the US wanted to contain communism, and for that Pakistan needed to be assisted. So that relationship has been working in a different way than the US-India relationship. Yes, Lucas.
I have a similar question about the India-Russia relationship that you. Thank you. I have a similar question about the India-Russia relationship that you pointed out on some of the slides with the arms trade, especially. So now that the relationship between Russia and America has worsened a lot, what do you think? Is India switching from one ally to another now? Because of course it will be hard for India to justify improving relationships with the US without actually worsening its relationship with Russia.
Okay, so yeah, that's a question that's troubling many policymakers in many parts of both the countries. But I think it's not a question of moving from one ally to another. See, India has never been an ally either of Russia. It's too large to be an ally. In the sense that the US sees or Russia sees allies. India is a huge country, it has its own foreign policy, it has its own vision of the world, and therefore it cannot be ally in the certain sense as we speak about it. However, the relationship between India and Russia that used to be there is no more as strong and deep. And on that, you're right, it has been so for the last 10, 15 odd years when India has had several issues with Russian components supplied for the hardware that India was running. Specifically, there were some issues with the delays in the aircraft carrier that Russia supplied to India. It was delayed by almost 10 years with huge cost overruns. That is one of the issues. There are several other issues that have, time and again come in the relationship. Also, Russia is not what it used to be in terms of the economic part as well. India is not what it used to be. It's now almost, it is growing very fast. It's a large economy in itself. So that relationship is changing. Having said that, I would also like to mention that any of the relationships that you see, with China, with the US, with Russia, all of these relationships are actually independent of each other. So, just like the US, India sees its own self-interest, the national interest, and the relationship is built on that. Now, which relationship at any given point in time takes precedence is depends on a number of factors. As of this moment, it seems that the India-US partnership seems to be going very well. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the importance of the private sector moving forward, and this may be an inaccurate view of the world, but my impression is that the call center has been an important aspect of international trade between the United States and India. Speculatively looking forward, and in China, for example, this again may be an inaccurate statement, but the impression that one has is that China has been a low-cost manufacturer of many, many different kinds of products. Looking at it from your personal perspective and in a speculative way, what do you see as the specific ways in which the Indian economy may blossom in a fashion that will engage the private sector economically with the United States?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, is that so far the role of the private sector in the relationship between US and India has been centered more towards the call center aspect in terms of the service industry. Yes, to an extent that's true in terms of the service industry. It has more or less been outsourcing of services that were earlier performed in the US because of the cost factors shifting over to India. But that again is a narrative that has changed over the last 10 years because India has now been losing out in that, and countries like Vietnam, other countries have taken over that market. What is now happening is that there is a kind of a skill upgradation in terms of value-added services. And there is more interaction between US companies and Indian companies in terms of these higher-end IT services. And that is where I see the future of the service industry to be in terms of this relationship. Yes.
How does the new relationship between the United States and India affect the future of Afghanistan with the withdrawal of the American troops?
Okay, so Afghanistan was an issue that was discussed between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. Specifically, the issue of withdrawal of US forces from there, and also what happens once the US forces leave. So India has a lot of investment in Afghanistan in terms of assisting the country in its infrastructure development since a very long time. India and Afghanistan also have had very strong ties, cultural ties. At the same time, currently, India is also the second largest donor to Afghanistan after the US. That aid that India gives to Afghanistan is in billions of dollars. So there is huge Indian investment there, and rightly India is worried about what happens once the US leaves. As far as my understanding of the whole situation goes, the security aspect is something that India and US are still working on with respect to the Afghan issue. So the US welcomes India's participation in Afghanistan's development, infrastructure development, economic development, social development and all those. In terms of the security aspect, I am not sure about that. How far US can balance that with concerns that Pakistan has, concerns that that might be there otherwise. Yes, sir.
Like President Obama, you seem reluctant to refer to Islamic terrorists, which is fine. But you have a country that has a very large Muslim population. And I'm wondering, is the Muslim population in India generally considered loyal to India or not considered loyal? For instance, in the US, we have quite a large Muslim population, which most Americans think is loyal to the US. Other countries don't feel that. England and France is a different story. They have not integrated. Our Muslim population is mostly integrated and have a good life in America. They love America. I'm wondering how that is in India, because I was in India last year and it's very obvious there's a big Muslim population there. So what is your see? How do you see that?
Before I answer this question, I would like to bring it to your notice that what appears in sections of the Western media with respect to ethnic and religious issues from India may not entirely be true. And what I have seen over the years is, and out of experience, out of talking to people, out of my own experience in several countries, is that the media plays an important role in shaping what are perceptions about X and Y. So I just wanted to make that clear. Coming to the specific question that you have, it's a question that really surprises me, because this question doesn't really arise in India in terms of whether the Muslims or the Christians or the Buddhists or the Hindus, for that matter, anyone, are loyal to the country or not. The question arises with respect to a person regardless of his faith. That is a different matter, when even a Hindu can not be loyal. So that's a different matter altogether. But with respect to a community, and especially not only it's a large population, you would be happy to know India is also the second largest country with Muslim population after Indonesia. So it has the second largest number of Muslims in the world. Also, our past indicates that there has not been any involvement of homegrown terrorists, as you might say, as you might see in the US as well, also on certain occasions. But so most of the terrorism that you see in India is coming from across the border, and there are really no issues between the Indian communities on that count.
Thank you.
A moment.
Well, in that light, can I raise perhaps something you don't want to get into, but the Prime Minister Modi had a very bad press in America following the troubles that occurred in Gujarat a few years ago, quite a few years ago. And it's probably true that our press latched on to this. And what about people? A lot of people in India, I think too, felt that he was not sufficiently worried about what was happening to the Muslim population there in Gujarat. And well, anyway, could you say something about this? I mean, it's an uncomfortable topic, but it's still, we hear people mention it from time to time.
Okay, so if I were to put an analogy, the African-American relationship here with the whites is something that worries the rest of the world. It doesn't worry many people here. And there have been several instances where you see, or at least a section of the press feels that, these issues are not being addressed. So now whether that section of the press is right or wrong needs to be decided by the criminal justice system of the country, whether it is in the US or it is in India. And similarly, in India as well, the criminal justice system there's an extremely independent judiciary. We have Supreme Court just like yours, we have high courts, and despite numerous investigations and all kinds of inquiries, nothing has been framed or charged against the Prime Minister. So to continue this topic, regardless of lack of any evidence, any legal justifiable evidence anywhere, is just pulling on what has appeared on the media without any basis. So there is really no issue on continuing this kind of this thing, because then without that kind of evidence you can go anywhere, talk about anything, and that really means nothing. That's why I mentioned in the initial stages about the role of the media and how certain sections, I'm not saying the entire media, but certain vested sections may have their own interests to pursue rather than the interest that they should be doing as an impartial observer. Let me give you another example of slightly different, but again speaking of media. 3-4 years ago, when the revolts in the Arab world started happening, remember that time? Every single Western newspaper was writing, democracy is flourishing. Was it not? We in the rest of the world, even at that time, knew this is not democracy flourishing in most of the cases. This is militant Islam taking over, which now the US also says. So what happens is, there are journalists who sit in the cities, talk to certain liberals, devise their opinion on the basis of that, and that carries on. So perhaps this is where we should agree to disagree, if that is the right way to put it. Yes, sir.
It's not about terrorism now, climate. So India has now, I read this statement by the Environment Minister that India was digging a lot of coal, which is poor quality coal. And many Western countries were talking about how this is degrading the environmental standards all over the world. And the simple statement given was that Western countries have had their chances of development, have had gone through the process of development and polluted they've had their fair share of pollution. And now it's India's turn to do that, and they should have a chance to do that. Plus, what you showed in the slides was slightly contradicting this thing that they'll work on environmental development. So, which one is it? Like, what is Prime Minister Modi's stance on this thing?
I didn't get the question exactly. I mean, what I showed on the slides was what has been agreed to between the two nations.
Yeah.
So that's a fact. And are you talking about the view in terms of differentiated responsibilities, or what exactly?
So, industrialization will cause a lot of pollution, and the Environment Minister's statement was very clear that this will go on for some time. And
okay, so I understand. I think I understand. You mean to say whether coal-based power plants will come up or not? The use of coal as a source of energy, will it continue to be used? Is that the question?
coal was just one sector,
Right.
which was talked about at that time, but the statement was more general in all other sectors.
Okay, so as I understand the question, yes, there has been, and like I said, the differences between the two countries climate was one area where even though some agreements are there on clean energy, there was a substantial difference before this visit on how to look at cutting the emissions, the carbon emissions. And that difference was that the US and the West had this viewpoint that since India is a large emitter, it is the third largest emitter now, therefore needs to control emissions, just like the rest of us. The Indian view and the developing world view was, no, that's not correct. Because you burnt your own forests, you did everything in your own country, caused the environment to degrade. Now you're developed, you want the other countries not to develop. So that was the view coming from India. And therefore the initial discussions, all of which that have taken place, were from an Indian standpoint of what is known as common but differentiated responsibilities. And that was the basic building block for initiating any climate-related discussions till now. Which means that yes, there is a common responsibility for humankind to control emissions. How it needs to be done will differ according to country and level of development. So that part of India's policy is still there. At the same time, what the Prime Minister has said now is, we realize that there is a need to control the emissions and in a much more rapid manner than it has been done in the past. Now what is the way to do it? The way to do it is to move towards more cleaner sources of energy. Whether nuclear deal is a part of that, also solar energy is a part of that. So India has raised its target by 2020 of solar energy to 100 gigawatt, which is a huge target. So that is how the views are now emerging, and that is what the Environment Minister must have meant. Yes.
My question has to do with. Thank you. Dave Edick, San Diego World Affairs Council. My question has to do with India in East Africa. There is a large Indian diaspora there. Could you describe the depth of India's relationship with countries such as Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, Madagascar, especially in the field of energy?
David, you've really got me on the wrong foot on that one, at least with respect to several countries. I can only tell you about a couple of countries which I'm aware of, but in terms of the others, East Africa, yes. So East Africa has always been a kind of a area that India has a lot of Indian immigrants, has a lot of Indian diaspora. Also, a number of East African countries also look up to India in various international fora. So there has been close cooperation on various issues. In terms of energy, where that cooperation is leading, there are some investments in Sudan, in South Sudan, which is now a separate country. So those investments relate to oil and equity participation by Indian companies there. So that is an area that has already been tapped, has been working since a long time. But as a matter of policy, the Indian companies, the energy companies, are actually scouting several areas in the world. As far as Sakhalin Island in Russia to countries in Latin America, for getting these equity stakes in energy companies, local energy companies in different countries. In Africa, South Sudan is the only example that I am aware of as of now. In terms of the energy relationship moving forward, I'm sorry, I really don't have an answer to that. Yes, Bob.
Critics of the nuclear deal always argue that if the U.S. supplies uranium to India, it will permit India to divert its own uranium to nuclear weapons production. You hear this in the foreign policy establishment. What's India's response to this charge?
Yes, you're absolutely right that this has been an issue. In fact, one of the sticking points to the deal till as late as 3 months ago was that the US was insisting on having its own inspectors go to the nuclear reactors to verify the use that the fuel was being put to. India, of course, did not agree to that, and India said that no, we will only agree to what is the international norm, and the international norm is that there will be inspections by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and that is what eventually happened. So this concern has been there, but to address this concern, both the countries have agreed on demarcating what are civilian facilities and what are strategic facilities. So a part of this agreement was out of the total number of, and I will not tell you the total number, but the total number of nuclear reactors. Out of that, a certain segment has been earmarked for civilian purposes, which is open to inspection. And a certain number has been earmarked for strategic purposes, which is not open to inspection. So therefore, the monitoring of fuel can take place, whether it is being used in this or being taken elsewhere. Thank you. Thank you for your questions.